Good morning and welcome to the final day of the Space and Geospatial Virtual Pavilion for COP26. My name is Andy Bennett and I'm the Space Lead at KTN. And I'm here today at AAC Clyde Space in Glasgow, so big thanks to them for hosting us today. And I'm delighted to introduce this session, looking at some great examples of the use of space and geospatial data and exploring the limits of that use. We have some great, what I'm calling end users here today. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to our excellent chair, Anushka Sharma. Over to you to introduce the panel.
Andy, thank you very much. Good morning. As Andy just said, my name is Anushka Sharma. I'm the founder of Space and Tech Innovation Consultancy Naaut. It is my pleasure to drive the conversation today. Good morning, good afternoon, and indeed good evening, wherever you might be joining us from today. I'm currently beaming to you live from Cinica in Bologna. It's the largest Italian computing center. So I'm delighted to bring a little bit of the high performance computing into the conversation today. Today, we're going to discuss getting the end user perspective. This panel will explore how end user companies are deploying space and geospatial data in order to support their net zero and climate change ambitions. Specifically, we're going to use this time to hear from leaders who will describe some key use cases and opportunities. Hopefully, this panel, we're also going to explore the challenges and barriers to adoption of geospatial data and end user data with a positive note towards the end on collaboration to foster innovation and drive the impact-focused outcomes we're all wanting to see. So to our lovely audience, I'd invite you all to send your questions in via the event platform. We'd like to get through as many of those towards the end of our session. But first of all, let me just tell you who we'll be hearing from today. We're going to be hearing from Judith Batchelor, who's a special advisor on corporate responsibility and sustainability, Brexit and public affairs at Sainsbury's. We'll also hear from Bob Steer, the chief engineer at Severn, Trent Water. We'll also be joined by Sarah Hayes, climate resilience demonstrator project lead at the National Digital Twin Programme at the Centre for Digital Built Britain. And lastly, but definitely not least, we'll be hearing from Elspeth McIntyre, the Senior Geospatial Consultant at Atkins. Atkins is one of the world's most respected design and engineering project management consultancies. So with that, each of our presenters is going to be sharing a short presentation, just introducing the work that they're doing currently, particularly in line with our topic. So first up, I'd like to hand over to Judith, who will be joining us and presenting first. Welcome, Judith. Over to you.
Brilliant, and thank you very much. And I'm very conscious that I've got lots of slides and I've only got a few minutes to get across the message. So I think the first thing to say is that at Sainsbury's, we are a UK retailer, but we're a global business sourcing from over 70 countries around the world, which is complicated. And if you look at what we've been doing in that space, we've been using geospatial technologies for both our sourcing of things on sea and on land, working with multiple partners. And I know we're going to come and talk about collaboration at the end. But most of what this started off at was with a lovely project called Ocean Minds. And Ocean Minds came out of government investment in the satellite applications catapult at Harwell in Oxfordshire. And it was set up basically using some really interesting vessel monitoring data. And that vessel monitoring data can tell us all sorts of things about what kind of ships, where they are, and what they're doing when they are thousands of miles away in the middle of the ocean. And you might say, well, so what? But the so what is really important, because for us as a retailer, we want to be making sure that we're sourcing legally, we're sourcing in a way that is kind to the environment, and that enhances both our reputation and helps us actually to make a positive impact on those things. The oceans are really important to us, as you can see here. And they haven't been well looked after, whether that's issues around acidification, whether that is issues around plastic pollution, the destruction of biodiversity, so on and so forth. So we know that we need to take action on those things. So Ocean Mind works by literally pulling together all of those Earth observation technologies, multiple databases, to be able to tell us whether our fish is being caught legally, but also whether we're protecting the oceans. So for example, we sell a thing called fad-free tuna. Fads are fish aggregation devices, but not only do they aggregate the fish that you want to catch, that you would normally catch in a free school of fish, they attract things like dolphins, turtles, sharks, so on and so forth, which has a negative impact on biodiversity. That is perfectly legal, but we know it's not good enough. So Ocean Mind then led to Forest Mind. Forest Mind is in development as we speak, again, with the satellite applications catapult and £2 million of funding from the European Space Agency. Forest Mind is not just tackling illegal deforestation, and as you know, there's new regulation on that, both in Europe and in the UK. And we as a retailer will need to provide deforestation-free products. But again, this is not about just complying with legal things. It is about making sure that we're doing positive things. So yes, we will validate and verify things, but also we will be able to use this to assess our supply base, the suppliers that are doing the good things and perhaps suppliers who aren't doing as much as they could, and supplying that data and sharing that data ultimately with our customers, who can then choose to make decisions on the products they choose to buy on the basis of the information that we can share with them, but currently is opaque. And the really important point here is that historically, we would have used certification, so things like the Forest Stewardship Council or the Marine Stewardship Council, but those are paper-based systems that are based on a once-a-year audit. This information is almost real time and it is constant information, so we are constantly surveying these things. And we like to talk about this as moving from certification, which is a promise, to verification, which is an assurance. But it's much more than just an assurance. It can then do all sorts of other things, like looking at not just whether things are deforestation free, but whether they're authentic. So is it an oak tree? And if it's an oak tree, where is that oak tree grown, or where isn't it grown? And that includes multiple partners doing things like isotopic testing, which means that we can not only just look at the DNA and the species, but look at where that species was grown, and I say the ultimate verification. And then finally, and sorry to whiz through all of this, if you start to think about how you can do that with all sorts of other things, and I'm thinking here around our supply chains, this happens to be avocados grown in Colombia. How do you know that your avocados grown in Colombia are grown in areas where there are biodiversity risks, there are species that are at threat and on the international list of endangered species? So the possibilities are infinite. We're looking forward to this because it really does enable us to make guarantees to our customers, rather than perhaps some of the promises that we would make with more traditional supply chain systems. So that's me. Thank you for listening, and looking forward to your questions later. Thank you.
Fantastic. Judith, thank you so much. I'm now going to hand over to Bob Steer, the Chief Engineer at Severn Trent Water. Bob, over to you for your introductory slides.
Great. Well, if you could put the first slide on, that'd be brilliant. So from avocados in Colombia to the glamorous world of sewage and water in the Midlands in the UK. So I thought I'd just put a slide up just to say who we are for starters. So we're a Midlands-based water company. We serve about 8 million people. And I think the thing that's going to be important in a minute in this conversation is that we've we've got the happy task of treating every day about 2 billion litres of wastewater and supplying the same. And that wastewater is full of brilliant stuff. It's full of chemical energy, it's full of nutrients, it's full of heat energy. And so the opportunity for us to do brilliant things in the carbon space is there. And like many companies, we made a triple carbon pledge, which is around net zero by 2030. And you can see that at the top of the screen. I think the thing that I'd like to just draw your attention to at the bottom is, the trouble is, of course, we're across a fairly big geographical area, although not Columbia, to be fair. But we've got about 49,000 kilometres of water mains and similarly 94,000 kilometres of sewers. So we've got a very distributed system emitting lots of process emissions. And it's the process emissions I'd really like to talk about. And you might be thinking I'm coming here to tell you about really, really clever stuff we've done with the connection to space. What I'm really coming to do is to seek your help, because I'm figuring if we can measure remote gases on Mars using your technology, we can definitely do it on a sewage works in Coventry, I'm thinking. So the last point is we have got about 1,000 sewage works. So, right from the sort of, not much bigger than a bathtub, right up to our site that serves Birmingham, about 400 million litres a day. And that gives us a real challenge around these process emissions. So perhaps if you go on to the next slide, and my physics teacher would kill me at the bottom, actually, back in the day, because I've put a unit without a time dimension. So we, as a company, have worked out, we currently believe we emit about 190,000 tonnes a year of process emissions in terms of greenhouse gas equivalents, carbon dioxide equivalents. And that's alongside all the other indirect emissions. So, and what is that from, I hear you ask? Well, it's from things like methane, it's from things like nitrous oxide, and it's from things like carbon dioxide itself. And so I've just taken one site here because I'm hoping some clever folk out there can help us, because this is an aerial picture of Finham, which is a Coventry sewage treatment works. And just as by way of example, we've got 1,000 of these. And you can see that the rough process there is a crash course. I've got a 1-minute version of sewage treatment, which is we screen the big lumps out at the start, not very glamorous. We take grit out because grit comes off the road. And there's lots of opportunities to do clever stuff with those. Anyone who's ever made beer will know that if you stick a big sludgy thing in a tank and sit it there for a couple of hours, the sludgy stuff settles to the bottom and the fat stuff floats to the top. But then we need to use bacteria, and those bacteria we've been using for about 100 years, which turn the soluble pollution, if you like, into solid mass that we can then settle out and remove before it goes to the river, which is brilliant, except for the fact we've recently learned that those processes themselves emit about 128 kilotons of carbon dioxide equivalent. So the challenge for the audience today, this is what I'd love some help with, is, of course, many of us don't directly measure all the things that we're emitting. And we have many assumptions, and we'll have big, complicated spreadsheets that will make assumptions on the population, the amount of ammonia in the system, and therefore, how much do you think you must be emitting? I think if we're going to really tackle these process emissions, we need to do much more actual real-time measurement. And given the dispersed nature of our operation, realistically, we need to be able to do that remotely. And we can use things like drones to measure methane. We're doing that quite a lot. But currently, nitrous oxide problem is a real conundrum for us. And frankly, it's the thing that stands between us succeeding or not succeeding on around our net zero journey. So if you need a challenge, there it is, team. Nitrous oxide remote monitoring, 1,000 sites.
Bob, thank you so much. And it's actually really great to introduce Sarah Hayes again. She's the Climate Resilience Demonstrator Project Lead for the National Digital Twin Programme at the Centre for Digital Built Britain. Sarah, you represent a whole different perspective. So please, over to you for your introductory slides.
Thank you, Anushka. I'm just trying to find the right slide here to start on. This one will do if it'll stay on that side. So I work with the National Digital Twin Programme, and I lead our Climate Resilience Demonstrator Project, Credo, which is funded by UK Research and Innovation. And actually, we've got a stand in the Green Zone at COP26 today, and my colleague Rachel will be there. So if you are at COP, then please go along and have a chat with Rachel. But what I want to talk about is Credo. And so what Credo is a climate change adaptation digital twin. And what we're doing is we are working with Anglian Water, BT and UK Power Networks, and we are pulling their data about their assets in a particular area in East Anglia. to be able to create a digital twin of the infrastructure system. So it's a digital twin of the water network, the energy network, and the telecoms network. And what we're doing here is we're identifying the interdependencies across the network so that we can anticipate, if there were a particularly bad flood, how that infrastructure system would be impacted by the flood. And of course, with climate change, we're going to see increased incidence of extreme weather events, such as flooding. So we want to understand with this demonstrator project, what would be the impact of a flood on the infrastructure system, and therefore, what are the interventions that we could make in terms of capital planning to protect the system against such a particularly bad flood in the future. But what we are doing here is we're working with confidential asset data that's been held securely on the DAFNE, the Data Analytics for National Infrastructure platform. We also want to tell a very public story about what we're doing here, because we want other people to be doing the same sort of thing. We want others to be able to follow the approach here. We're developing future best practice in connecting digital twins by applying an information management framework approach to connecting digital twins and connecting data sets in a scalable way. So we want to be able to tell a very public story, but of course we're working with confidential asset data and we're talking about critical national infrastructure. So what we've done is we've created this app, this Credo app, which basically runs you through what something like Credo would do. So the user is invited, this is the screen that you see at the beginning of the app, and the user is invited to walk through a particular scenario. So it's a particularly bad flooding scenario. So we've got this storm, Ruby. It's a terrible storm that sweeps across this fictional city. And that's what we've had to do. To tell this story, we've had to create a fictional city. So we're using geospatial data to just create a fictional city, but a realistic fictional city, to understand what the impact would be if there is a particularly bad flood, and whether it's tidal surge or river surge, surface flooding, etc. And if you go through the app, and I do encourage you to have a go on the app, I'll put the link in the chat, then you will see that at the end of this particularly bad storm, all the infrastructure assets that you can see here in the picture are out of service. So telecoms in pink, out of service, water assets in blue, out of service, and also the power assets in green, also out of service. So it's been a really bad storm that's put everything out of service. You are then invited to play the role of the water company, which I'll skip over today because we're short of time. But you are limited in the amount of information you have if you're the water company, because you can only see your own network. But if you are given the digital twin, the connected digital twin to play with, then you have visibility across all networks, and you have a number of options and interventions that you can make. So you can click on assets to see what they are. So you can see that this particular asset here is a primary substation, and it's a particularly important substation because 17 other assets rely upon it. So you then have the option of, say, moving that substation. And if you were to do that, it shows you that it has a significant impact across the whole city. So now you've got most of the buildings have power. Only the areas in the bottom right-hand corner of that map are affected. And there's less disruption generally across the whole of the city. There are some other options that you can have a look at. As I said, I would encourage you to have a go later on. But the point of this really is to show people what the benefits are and why it's more helpful to have all that information presented in front of you in a geospatial way, to be able to understand why we need to share data in this way. Because normally you don't see telecoms and water and energy companies just openly sharing data, and we're trying to sort of demonstrate here that they will benefit from doing this because they will have a greater understanding of how their networks will be impacted by climate change in the future, and therefore what they can do now to improve resilience across the system. I'll also mention that we've produced a film, and I'll put a link in the chat to the film, which also tells the story of what this is about. Thank you.
Judith, thank you so much. We're going to come to Elspeth, and just a gentle reminder to our audience to do submit your questions to our audience, which we'll try and get through as many as possible via the event platform. Elspeth McIntyre is joining us from Atkins, and she's a senior geospatial consultant. Elspeth, welcome. Over to you.
Thanks, Anushka. Yes, as Anushka says, I'm from Atkins. I'm going to be sharing some of the ways in which we as a company are currently addressing net zero from a spatial point of view, and a little bit about ourselves as well. So just a very quick rundown. In the geospatial team within Atkins, obviously a much larger company, we have around 90 geospatial professionals, incorporating drone pilots, geomatic specialists, survey, spatial analysts, and data scientists as well. Among that cohort, we've got members who frequently interface with the rest of industry, which will become important as I address further. Members of staff who sit on the ISO BEM working group, the ICE Geospatial Engineering Expert Panel, the IEMA Digital Assessment Panel, etc. We really believe in bringing all of these points of view to the same table. As I said, we are a consulting services provider, so we work with the full gamut of different sectors. It might be a free port one day, it might be a local authority, national government, rail, road, aviation, any of these sectors coming to us and saying, can you solve this problem for us? So we're in a really unique special spatial position of knowing what all of these different challenges and opportunities are from across the sectors and being able to bring solutions to all of them by combining the learning from one with another. So if I take us now to the issue of net zero, why do we believe it should be spatial? Well, net zero is a really complex challenge. It requires inputs from multiple sectors. I don't think anyone would dispute that claim. We believe between these diverse concerns, whether that's transportation, whether that's housing, the environment itself, location is probably the only unifying factor. So an electric charging post for a car doesn't have that much in common with an area of trees that's planted for biodiversity. But if they exist in the same space or next to each other, then you need to look at them together in order to make sure any interdependencies are taken into account. So just some best practice that we've learned from different projects to give you an insight into some of our processes. We believe you should use data to focus on insights. Don't look at the data itself on its own, but look at ways that you can combine different data and come up with a better result. The images that you're seeing on the screen are current energy performance of buildings and then the potential that can be reached on average within an area. You'll notice some don't appear to have any cross-hatching on them. They're just a plain pinkish or orange shape. That's because there is no potential average improvement in energy performance, even if lots of energy efficiency measures are put in place. A decision maker needs to then focus their resources on the areas which are actually going to achieve the best results. So they need to focus on, for example, the bright red square in the center, which has a pale green cross-hatching, indicating it can really improve energy performance on average for those buildings. So that's what we're wanting to do for clients, give them actual things they can act on. Secondly, we need to connect issues to get more actionable insights. So as other presenters were saying, Sarah in particular, connecting data from different disciplines can really help to get a better result for all of those disciplines together. The mapped data on screen is different buildings with the energy performance I've just discussed, but you can also see red lines. The thickness indicates the amount of carbon emissions being produced by traffic along those roads. And then blue lines, which are sewers. So just as Bob said, sewers do produce heat energy. That's actually something that can be used. You can use a sewer source heat pump to connect to houses which are within a certain distance and where the sewer pipe is within a certain radius. So knowing all of these things together can really help build up a picture of a net zero future for us. Thirdly, use non-traditional data to understand behaviour. So as Judith mentioned, the data sets that you might have in a more traditional project are ones which are compiled, then left, then compiled again to update them, and then again left. They always have some kind of element of lag time between the real world and the data that you're representing and using for analysis and solutions. What's coming in now is a huge data resource that's coming from non-traditional data suppliers, people you wouldn't think of using on an EIA, for example, an environmental impact assessment, but who have much better data that can give us much better idea of what's going on. The data in the background here is a publicly available Strava heat map. I've actually had access via different project work to the full data that sits behind that heat map. So I know, for example, from my client in Edinburgh, I know how many people are using different roads for running and cycling, what times they go out at, what days of the year. Are they going out during the dark? Are they male or female? Are there areas which only males use after dark, for instance? I think that's a question that we could all relate to in events over the last year. So having that data and knowing that that gives you an up-to-date picture, whether it's during COVID times, whether it's looking at now at this transition as we move back to this brave new world, or whether it's looking at the past and seeing what's changed, this is the kind of data that can give you those answers in a way non-traditional or traditional data never could have done. So using these three kind of practices together, looking for insights, making sure you're using non-traditional data and combining different sectors means you can get really meaningful sustainability outcomes. The map in particular is Edinburgh again. The Strava data has been incorporated along with about 25 other different data layers which tell you where the opportunities for natural capital improvements to ecosystem services are around the city. Traditionally, you would have seen perhaps air pollution displayed separately from carbon sequestration, displayed separately from biodiversity or recreation, social value. But using spatial methods, you can bring them all together. This as a grid, which we've used to do the spatial analysis in quite a rapid way over a 6-week program. And you can see here that you can compare oranges to oranges and get really good results that have these mutual benefits for all the different sectors. But that's it from me. So I'll hand back over to Anushka now, and we'll go on with the panel.
Fantastic. Elspeth, thank you so much. So for our audience listening, we've heard from many different perspectives, and I'm now going to ask all of our panelists to join me on screen so that we can kick off with one of the key areas that we're hoping we'd like to really share insights from the case studies that we've been able to present and showcase to you. And really it's how easy has it been to deploy geospatial data in support of climate action within your organization. And I think hearing maybe from Bob first, you've mentioned the things that you're really looking for, but in areas where you've been successful, what have been the easier parts of the solutions so far that have been an easier thing to deploy?
Yeah, sure. So I suppose, I guess, if I think about the necessity being the mother of invention and all that, I think we've had, similarly, we had drone pilots for quite a while. For example, we've been working at ways of getting more value out of those systems. I think it's not until we've felt a real pang of genuine urgency around something that, if we don't solve it, is going to be a real challenge for us. And so I think that the theme for me is, when we're really, really clear on the need, we can get stuff done really quickly. And then I think we can be fairly imaginative about how we go and source and find that. If we're not really clear on it, I think, we frankly don't know where to look. And simply, I guess our sector is, it's full of, it tends to be full of engineers, in a certain type of mindset. So I think one of the biggest challenges is not knowing what we don't know. So I think for me, a session like this is all around kind of lifting the head up and kind of going, actually, who else has had to solve these problems already? Yeah. And where else might there be kit that can help us?
I actually couldn't agree more. I feel like the unknown unknowns that we all talk about, we can learn so much from other industries and sectors that are doing it their own way. And Judith, you've sort of given us an example of a supply chain that's global. Tell us more about the ways that geospatial data has been a positive, has had positive outcomes in the work you're doing.
Yeah, no, definitely. And I think actually, Bob, as you were explaining some of the ways of working and challenges, I was thinking about our own business, and the way that we sold this in originally was around legal compliance and risk mitigation. And quite often, particularly with big businesses who've got lots of choices to make, the way in is through legal compliance and risk mitigation. But once you've found your way in with those tools, as you develop them, you realize that risk mitigation to competitive advantage is a continuum. So by doing those things really well, as you say, you learn new things. Those new things give you a competitive advantage. And I think particularly as we talk about, the race to net zero, the race to resilience here at COP, that you can see that these tools are going to be able to help us manage those massive transitions. And the Ocean Mind one is a good example. It started off as risk mitigation and legal compliance, because 25% of the world's fish is caught illegally, unregulated and unreported. It moved into a biodiversity tool because of the fish aggregation devices. And now we're thinking about how we put that onto a label, so we can tell customers that the fish that they're buying is assured. And making those connections will really give us a competitive advantage, because we know that 67% of our customers want to make more sustainable decisions, but they don't know how, because they don't have the information. And what information is out there isn't always necessarily facts-based information. It's more about nuances, and sometimes those things can be a bit disingenuous, to put it mildly. So verification, connecting customers with where their products come from, but just be prepared to start off at the other end of the scale, which is manage the safe and legal, and the rest will follow.
Yeah, and actually I'd love for Sarah and Elspeth to comment more on sort of like potential ways. I feel like there's a lovely collaboration that could happen with the work that you're both doing. What would be the areas that you would help each other in? And particularly, Judith, on a consumer angle, we're all looking at COP26 and thinking about what our actions as individuals, as part of the wider collective mindset, can help to achieve with the results we want to see. But Sarah, let me come to you first. Like, what are ways that the impact of your study is now starting to show people the solutions that they could maybe attack, so to speak?
Yeah, so the research is underway at the moment. We have a technical team busy getting on connecting data sets, but using, I mentioned before, this information management framework approach, which does address the sort of the quality of data issue and basic information management practices within organizations, because I think at the root of this is organizations really having a good understanding of what their level of information management is, and often it's very low levels, it's very poor. We work with paper-based information, and so that's sort of the very basic levels of it. But I guess one of the things I would say really is that we tend to take a fairly short-term view when we think about data and sharing data. And I think that's what holds us back, because this kind of thing, getting your information in order in a way to be able to share it with other organizations and to share it across other sectors, this process will take time, I think. And you really need to take that long-term perspective and recognize what the benefits are over a longer period of time, and that helps you justify the investment now. When you look at just sort of the next few years, that doesn't add up. So I think it's really important to take that longer term perspective. But what's happening with our project now is we want to be able to show other asset owners that they can follow a similar approach. That I think the key issue here is connecting data sets across organizations. We can do that because at the moment we're not connecting that many data sets, because not everyone is doing it yet. But when we get to a point where everyone sees the reason to do this, we're starting to connect many more data sets and digital twins, and we reach a scale problem, which is why you need a scalable approach, a replicable, scalable approach to doing that. And that really is that long-term view, rather than that, oh yeah, we can connect a few data sets right now, but what about the future when we're sort of getting more value out of our data across the entire ecosystem?
Absolutely. And Elspeth, what would you ask other cities around the UK, maybe even further away? What are the ways that you'd like to maybe open up such data sets and connect them, or show them what you've been able to achieve?
Well, I definitely agree with Sarah. I think we need to take a longitudinal view for data to see its value continue on. In our sector, we often talk about the design timeline with the different segments you have. So you have optioneering, you have design, you have construction, operation, eventually you have disposal of an asset. And we published a white paper earlier this year about how data moves through those stages, the idea that it's really a relay race rather than some kind of sprint that you're doing on your own. So the design engineer shouldn't be looking at that as something that he uses the data and then essentially drops the data that doesn't get used beyond his part of the work. He should be looking at that as something that he looks after. He has data standards integrated in from the beginning, and he's able to hand that over to the construction site manager in a way that works for her, that's got the right kind of information in it, that doesn't have too much wasteful information in it as well. You know, nothing where she would not see the trees for the wood. But something that will work and keep that data alive rather than some kind of dusty file system in a way that's not usable by different users. So for the city problem, where you have best practice that's been developed in one city, and what needs to happen is then for it to be rolled out to not lose that innovation and not lose that data integrity, is for the data that's used in that first city to be available elsewhere. And you have this kind of aspirational viewpoint that if you can access one data set in one city, then you can access it elsewhere. That's not always true. On the one hand, the authorities responsible for the city need to manage their own data and publish it in a way that others can use it rapidly, so it works for the timeline of projects, cost of projects, but they also need to start looking at the non-traditional data I mentioned. So currently I can access Strava data for a city where I have a client, but I cannot access the data for another city even an hour away unless I go through another request process. So I can't do a comparative analysis for that first city, and I can't transfer the innovation quite as easily to the second city, and neither can another consultant. So having a kind of democratized data access system in place in the UK, and the digital twin, as Sarah said, but at many, many different levels, lots of different participants outside of the traditional datascape, that is, I would say, the answer.
Yeah, I love that. So we've talked about the, as Judith said, sort of the legal and compliance aspects and the regulatory framework within your organisation before you kick that off. Bob, you're talking about the technological aspect, and I'm actually going to make a plea to any space startups out there. If you already have satellites in orbit that are looking at that methane data set, and you can point your satellite over Bob's sewage works for his organisation, there's a business model to be built there. And there's new business to be made. So if you are coming from that angle, I think this is how we need to join the dots between the space sector and the geospatial sort of remit and come together. And of course, Andy and Anita and the team can help introduce you to any of our panelists and follow up on conversations. We have talked about some of the barriers, but if there are other barriers that you've had to navigate or that people should be mindful of, I think access to data is definitely the biggest one. Does anyone have any advice of how you would go about? Is it a memorandum of understanding with other organizations and drawing up frameworks? Are there precedents? Are there ways that our audience could use? Elspeth, you're nodding, so I'll come to you first. What are the tools our audience could maybe look to?
Firstly, look at data standards. If they're not familiar with the data language, they will be able to find experts to help them. There are new standards all the time, and they're getting better and better at building on each other rather than sitting as one standard here, one standard there, and each person thinks they have the best one, but instead they've just created copies. We have really in-depth data standards in the UK, and those are informed by lateral ones which flow out to other countries. So following those existing standards is incredibly helpful, and making sure that your data, when you pass it on, will work in the different technologies as well, bearing in mind that it might go from GIS to CAD or vice versa, making sure it works for your audience in that technology.
Thank you. Judith, I'll come to you and then I'll come to Sarah.
Yeah, I agree with everything that Elspeth has just said. I think absolutely the data standards piece is important. I think the other thing is, particularly in our industry that is both global and UK based, using existing mechanisms is really key, because particularly getting global compliance on things is really, really difficult. And if I give you a good example, is the barcode. So the barcode is a universal global standard. So if you're a Nestle and you're selling Kit Kat everywhere in the world, you've got this universal barcode that's got all the information in it. We can link products to geospatial data through that barcode. And if we could put a geolocation number or a geospatial coordinate into a barcode, then suddenly lots of different databases could be linked to an individual product. That is hugely powerful. And it would solve us a global problem, and it would be a game changer. But that's easier said than done, because clearly there is a global standard, and working out what goes in that barcode is really important. But the key thing is, if you can use existing infrastructure through geospatial data, you can scale anything really quickly. And that's the real secret in this, to make sure that, you know, if those benefits are carbon emissions and being able to see those, or those benefits are health. So, for example, we've used this to look at families across the UK who get free school meals and use healthy start vouchers and link that to our stores, where we can then use our Nectar card to give them incentives to buy more fruit and veg. You wouldn't even think of using geospatial data as the connecting point between free school meals, a supermarket, and a Nectar bonus scheme. But you can. So I think my message would be, think about what you can connect with that data point, use existing mechanisms, and you can see the massive potential for geospatial data, massive.
That's incredible. Sarah, I'll let you respond, and then I've got a question from the audience I'd like to ask you next.
Yes, which I think I can build into my answer. If it's about Naaut, then so National Underground Asset Register, really it's the same, it's exactly the same point, sharing data across asset owners to be able to avoid utility strikes, etc., to when you're going to dig up the road, so other utility providers know when that road is going to be dug up, etc. So I was on the advisory panel to the pilot, so very aware of what's going on within that. But to enable the sharing of data, you need a data license. That's what that's what's happened in Naaut, that's what's happened in our climate resilience demonstrator project. But to convince the lawyers to sign that license, you need to demonstrate the benefits. You need to have, you need to be able to explain very clearly the rationale for sharing data. And it is absolutely about building trust between people. And that's where it really is, I think, at the end of the day. It's not just about having this tech to enable us to solve a problem. It's about collaboration between partners who don't normally work together. And that takes some time to build that trust, to get to that point where you will share data and start to solve problems collectively.
Well, actually, on that note of collaboration, as we're coming towards the end, we'll spill over just a few minutes, so if you'll bear with us. The key thing is collaboration and focusing around who you'd like to most collaborate with further in your work in climate action and using geospatial data. Bob, I know that you've mentioned methane data. We'd love to hear more about that, and who.
Nitrous oxide.
And nitrous oxide. Fabulous. Very direct and to point. Again, if you're a satellite operator, definitely think about how you can help Bob with his organization. Elspeth, how about yourself?
I'm really interested in speaking to people who hold data, who aren't necessarily sure what to do with it, who have unknown unknowns, so they don't know what it could achieve. They feel like they've got everything out of it, but you never know what's around the corner, what could be done with a different technique. So if you are that person, if you're holding a reservoir of data, or you're trying to get your data out there, you don't know how, I would love to hear your issues and perhaps discuss some solutions.
Thank you so much. And Judith, let me ask yourself.
Yeah, I would love to solve the nature crisis as well as the climate crisis. So I'd love to hear from people with really global databases on biodiversity indices.
Thank you so much. And lastly, to Sarah.
Yep, so in Credo we have energy, water and telecoms, but we don't have transport yet. So we'd like to expand it to include transport. So very interested in people who work in that area and want to get involved.
I love it. Look, our time has very quickly flown away with us. We've covered some fantastic angles on a local level through to sort of global levels, and looking at national infrastructure, local services, and of course, global supply chain, and that critical national infrastructure that we all depend on multiple times a day. I'm looking at you, Bob. It has been a pleasure to drive the conversation today. I'm very sorry if we haven't had a chance to answer all of your questions. I'm sure that the team are going to be picking up on these. If you're keen to connect and collaborate or learn from any more of us this morning, please do speak to the team who will help to connect the dots. Thank you to all of our panelists, so to Judith, Bob, Sarah, and Elspeth for your insights. And with that, I'm delighted to hand back over to Andy Bennett from the Knowledge Transfer Network. Thank you so much. You're just on mute, Andy. We've all done it.
There we go. Thank you very much, Anushka. That was fantastic. And thanks again to all the panelists for their contributions today. I just wanted to quickly run through what we've got coming up for the rest of today. So coming up at 10:45 today, we have two sessions. One on climate change in our urban environments, delivered by the Association for Geographic Information. And the second one is Ecosystems of the Future, delivered by the Satellite Applications Catapult. So don't miss those two. Then this afternoon, we have two more sessions. The first one hosted and curated by our friends at the University of Oxford and the Spatial Finance Initiative on the emerging intersection of smart space and finance. And also at the same time this afternoon, the power of location data, and that's curated by the Geospatial Commission. You can access all of these through the platform, so please do join them later on today. Finally, we'll be having some closing remarks kicking off at 3:45. Please don't miss that. We have some great final speakers who will be discussing all things COP. So a good wrap up of that. So thank you very much for joining today. Thanks again to the speakers, and look forward to seeing you in one of the sessions later on today.